I came home early and caught my parents talking to my aunt. My mom sighed and said Emma is always causing drama. If she moved out, we could finally have some peace. My dad agreed, saying she is too attached and she will never leave. I walked out without a word. 3 months later, they finally noticed I was gone. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Emma. I am 33 years old and I work as a senior financial auditor for a multinational corporation. For years, I have been the invisible pillar holding up my family and their crumbling facade of wealth. Growing up in an upscale suburban neighborhood, my parents Linda and Richard cared much more about their country club memberships and luxury cars than they did about actual financial stability or emotional warmth. Their entire existence revolved around maintaining an illusion of success for their friends and neighbors. I was never the daughter they wanted to show off. That role belonged to my younger sister Ashley. She was the golden child who spent money as fast as she could print it, and eventually married a flashy real estate broker named Terrence. My parents adored Terrence because he looked the part of a successful young professional, even though his lifestyle was built on a mountain of credit card debt. I, on the other hand, was pragmatic, quiet, and entirely focused on my career. To my parents, my sensible choices made me boring. My refusal to buy designer handbags made me a complete embarrassment. Last Thursday, my flight from Denver arrived 4 hours ahead of schedule. I decided to head straight to the house in the suburbs rather than going to my office downtown. The drive through our manicured neighborhood was peaceful, and I genuinely looked forward to a quiet evening at home. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, I immediately heard the clinking of crystal wine glasses and the sound of laughter echoing from the formal living room. My mother was entertaining her sister, my Aunt Carol, while my father poured them generous servings of a very expensive wine. I paused in the hallway, intending to drop my keys on the console table and announce my arrival. But my mother and her sharp voice stopped me dead in my tracks. "She is 33 years old and still leeching off us," my mother complained. Her voice was dripping with absolute disdain. I do not know where I went wrong with that one. Carol made a sympathetic noise and took a sip of her wine. "It must be so hard for you and Richard having an old maid daughter taking up space in this beautiful home, while Ashley is out there living such a fabulous life." My mother let out a dramatic, long-suffering sigh. "You have no idea, Carol. Emma is nothing but a burden. She acts like she owns the place just because she buys the groceries sometimes. And the drama she causes every time the utility bills arrive is completely unbearable. Just yesterday, she had the nerve to lecture Richard about turning down the central heating. If she moved out, we could finally have some peace and quiet in our own home." My father chuckled. It was a dismissive sound that made my stomach churn. "Oh, let us be realistic, Linda," he said smugly. "She is never going to move out. She is too attached to us and too cheap to afford a nice place in this economy. She needs this house more than we need her. She will be living in that upstairs bedroom until she turns 50. I stood frozen in the shadowy hallway, listening to the people who raised me tear me down for the entertainment of a gossiping relative. My hands gripped the stack of mail I had picked up from the porch mailbox on my way in. On top of the stack was an envelope I had specifically been waiting for. It was the annual property tax receipt from the county. I looked down at the paper in my hand. The total, printed in bold black ink, was exactly $15,000. And stamped right across the top in bright red letters was the word paid. Paid in full. Not by Richard, not by Linda, but by Titan Holdings, LLC. The sheer audacity of my parents' conversation was so staggering it almost took my breath away. They were sitting in a house they firmly believed was theirs, drinking wine they bought with a credit card I paid off every single month, and calling me a leech. They had completely rewritten history to protect their fragile egos. 4 years ago, my parents' obsession with keeping up appearances finally caught up with them. They went completely bankrupt. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on this very house, and my parents were weeks away from having their furniture thrown out onto the street. They cried and they begged. They talked about how the humiliation of losing their home would absolutely destroy them. I was the one who stepped in. Using the wealth I had quietly accumulated from my career as a financial auditor and my smart investments, I bought the house directly from the bank in cash. To save their precious pride, I used a limited liability company called Titan Holdings to make the purchase. This allowed them to tell their friends that they simply refinanced through a private firm. I let them stay in the house rent-free. I took over the property taxes, the insurance, and all the major maintenance costs. I even paid their outstanding utility bills. The drama my mother was complaining about to Aunt Carol was simply me asking them to close the patio doors while the air conditioning was running because the electric bill had spiked to over $600. I had saved them from absolute ruin, and in return they convinced themselves that I was a pathetic spinster camping out in their mansion because I had nowhere else to go. They genuinely believed their own lies. They thought they were the generous benefactors tolerating a disappointing child. Hearing their cruel laughter echo through the living room, I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to burst into the room and scream at them about the massive sacrifices I had made. The years of trying to earn their love and of quietly fixing their financial disasters while they constantly praised my sister suddenly meant absolutely nothing to me. A profound, icy clarity washed over me. I looked at the tax receipt one last time, feeling the heavy paper between my fingers. They wanted peace. They wanted me out of their house. I smiled. It was a cold, hard smile that did not reach my eyes. Without making a single sound, I turned on my heel and walked silently up the stairs. It was time to give them exactly what they asked for. I moved silently up the carpeted stairs, making sure to avoid the squeaky floorboard on the 7th step. Down in the formal living room, the sound of my mother laughing with Aunt Carol echoed through the hallway. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their financial lifeline was currently packing her bags. I stepped into my bedroom and closed the door with a soft click. There was no anger left in my chest. The resentment that had been simmering for years was suddenly replaced by a sharp clinical focus. I was a senior financial auditor. I handled million-dollar corporate discrepancies for a living. Liquidating a toxic asset like my family was simply business. I opened my closet and pulled out 2 large travel suitcases. I did not take everything. I only packed my tailored business suits, my expensive shoes, my laptop, and the casual clothes I actually cared about. I left behind the hideous, oversized sweaters my mother had gifted me for Christmas, and the cheap costume jewelry she always bought me on clearance. I moved to my personal safe hidden in the back of my closet and punched in the code. I retrieved my passport, my birth certificate, and the most important items of all: the thick manila folder containing the legal deed to the house, the LLC formation documents for Titan Holdings, and the original bank foreclosure paperwork from 4 years ago. I placed them securely into my leather briefcase. Sitting on the edge of the stripped mattress, I unlocked my phone and opened my banking application. This was where the real power transition would happen. I navigated to the automatic payments dashboard. For years, I had shouldered the entire operational cost of their luxurious suburban lifestyle. It was time to pull the plug. First, I selected the electricity account. My mother loved keeping the central air conditioning at a freezing 65 degrees during the summer while leaving the patio doors wide open. I hit the Cancel Autopay button. Next was the water and gas. Cancelled. Then I found the premium high-speed broadband internet account. Terrence, my sister Ashley's husband, practically lived on that internet connection. He spent his days streaming baseball games, trading volatile crypto stocks, and pretending to be a high-rolling real estate broker while contributing absolutely $0 to the household. I severed the payment method with a single tap. The most satisfying phase of my digital departure was the credit cards. I opened the account management page for my premium platinum account. There were 2 supplementary cards attached to my credit line. One belonged to Linda. She used it relentlessly for her weekly country club lunches, expensive salon blowouts, and wine deliveries. I clicked deactivate. The second card belonged to Ashley. My golden child sister always claimed she needed the card for absolute emergencies. Her definition of an emergency apparently included buying designer shoes, hosting lavish brunches with Terrence, and maintaining a fake rich lifestyle for her social media followers. I highlighted her card number and clicked deactivate. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation checkmark. The digital cord was officially cut. They were completely and utterly financially severed. I zipped up my 2 suitcases and grabbed my briefcase. I walked down the back staircase that led directly into the kitchen, avoiding the living room entirely. The marble countertops gleamed under the soft pendant lights. I took my house key off my keyring. I placed it gently on the center of the kitchen island, right next to the empty, expensive wine bottles they had opened earlier. I did not write a dramatic letter. I did not leave a tearful note demanding an apology. People who refer to their savior as a leech do not deserve explanations. I walked out the back door into the crisp night air. The suburban street was dead silent. I loaded my luggage into the trunk of my car and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove through the neighborhood, passing the large houses and manicured lawns, feeling lighter with every mile that separated me from my parents' toxic delusion. The next morning, brilliant sunlight streamed through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I woke up enveloped in the expensive high-thread count sheets of my luxury downtown penthouse. I had purchased this incredible apartment 2 years ago using the bonuses from my auditing career. I kept it a complete secret from my family, using it exclusively as my private home office and personal sanctuary. Had my parents or Ashley known about this place, they would have immediately demanded keys, thrown wild parties, and invited Terrence to crash on my custom velvet sofa. Keeping this penthouse hidden was the smartest investment I ever made. I stood on the glass balcony wrapped in a silk robe, looking out over the breathtaking city skyline. The automated espresso machine hummed and beeped in the pristine, modern kitchen behind me. I poured myself a cup of freshly brewed coffee and leaned against the railing, breathing in the crisp morning air. I picked up my phone and checked the screen. It was already 9 in the morning. There were absolutely 0 missed calls and 0 text messages from my parents. They probably had not even realized my bedroom was empty yet. They were likely still sleeping off their expensive wine hangovers, completely unaware that their financial safety net had vanished into the night. I smiled, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee. The 90-day countdown had officially begun. Without my credit card, the bills would bounce. Without my auto pay, the utility companies would start sending warning notices. I looked down at the bustling city streets below, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute freedom. I was eager to see exactly how long my peace-loving family could survive the harsh reality of the real world without my wallet to protect them. The first week of my strategic disappearance passed with a deafening silence. I spent my mornings running on my expensive treadmill overlooking the city, and my afternoons closing massive financial auditing contracts for my multinational corporate clients. I felt a profound sense of liberation. Yet there was a dark, twisted humor in the absolute silence from my biological family. Not a single phone call rang on my personal device. Not a single text message arrived asking if I was safe, or if I had eaten, or if I was even alive. An entire week passed, and my parents, Richard and Linda, along with my sister Ashley, simply went about their days completely oblivious to my empty bedroom. They assumed I was just sulking, hiding away on another grueling business trip to pay for their luxurious lifestyle. Their lack of concern confirmed everything I already knew. I was merely a walking wallet to them. By the 7th day, the digital guillotine I had set up finally dropped. The high-speed internet provider officially terminated the service at the suburban house due to the canceled automatic payments. I was sitting at my sleek glass dining table, reviewing a quarterly risk assessment for a major tech firm, when my phone screen suddenly lit up. It was a notification from the family group chat. I picked up the device and unlocked it. The message was from Ashley. It was not a question about my well-being. It was a direct entitled command. "Emma, what is wrong with the Wi-Fi network? Ashley typed her words practically dripping with annoyance. Terrence is in the middle of a massive real estate deal and he needs to send an urgent email to a VIP client right now. You need to come home and fix this immediately. I stared at the message and let out a genuine loud laugh. The sheer delusion of her text was almost impressive. Terrence, my 34-year-old African-American brother-in-law, was a master of grand illusions. He wore pristine tailored suits, drove a leased luxury sedan, and constantly boasted about his elite real estate portfolio. In reality, he had not closed a single property deal in over 14 months. His VIP client was likely just his fantasy football league, or a luxury car dealership he was trying to scam into giving him a test drive. They expected me to drop my actual multi-million-dollar auditing work, to rush back to the suburbs and troubleshoot their internet connection so Terrence could continue his unemployed cosplay. I looked at the screen watching the little read receipt icon appear under Ashley's demanding message. I wanted her to know that I saw it. I wanted her to know that I read her ridiculous command. Then without a single second of hesitation, I tapped the settings icon on the top right corner of the screen. I selected the option to leave the group. A confirmation prompt appeared asking if I was sure I wanted to permanently delete the conversation and remove myself from the chat. I pressed confirm. The family group vanished from my phone, leaving behind nothing but a beautiful blank space. Knowing Ashley and her desperate need for constant validation, I knew exactly where she would go next to vent her frustrations. I opened my alternate social media account and navigated straight to her public profile. Ashley lived her entire life for her online audience, projecting the image of a wealthy, perfect suburban wife. Sure enough, there was a glowing purple ring around her profile picture indicating a new live story update. I tapped the icon and watched the pathetic performance unfold. Ashley was filming herself in the gourmet kitchen of my house holding a ridiculously expensive iced coffee. She sighed dramatically into the camera, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "Hey guys," she whined to her followers. "I am having the most frustrating morning ever. My irresponsible older sister completely forgot to pay the internet bill again, and now the whole house is offline." The camera panned over to show Terrence sitting at the kitchen island. He was wearing a crisp navy blue suit, tapping aggressively on his laptop keyboard, and looking deeply inconvenienced. Terrence sighed heavily for the camera, shaking his head. "It is unbelievable, babe," he said in his smooth, practiced voice. "I have international investors waiting on these contracts. This kind of unreliability is exactly why I hate relying on other people. I watch them perform their fake outrage from the comfort of my penthouse." Terrence was blaming me for his imaginary failed deals while sitting in a house I owned, using electricity I had paid for up until a week ago. Ashley turned the camera back to her perfectly contoured face. "It is just so exhausting dealing with people who do not take their responsibilities seriously," she complained. "But anyway, I am not going to let her toxic energy ruin my vibe today. We have to focus on the positive things coming our way." Ashley suddenly smiled, her mood shifting instantly from annoyed to ecstatic. She clapped her hands together, revealing a massive diamond ring that was undoubtedly purchased on my credit line. "I have a huge announcement," she squealed into the camera. "Next month, Terrence and I are celebrating our 5-year wedding anniversary. We are throwing the most spectacular, lavish backyard gala right here at our estate. It is going to be incredibly exclusive, catered by top-tier chefs, and decorated like an absolute dream. Terrence deserves the best, and I am going to give him a party that this neighborhood will never forget. Stay tuned for the luxurious details." The video ended and the screen went black. I lowered my phone, resting it on the cool glass table. A slow, dark satisfaction spread through my veins. Ashley was publicly promising her husband and her followers a spectacular upscale anniversary party in the backyard of an estate she falsely claimed to own. She was planning to hire expensive decorators, fully expecting my credit cards to fund her grand romantic gesture. They were building a massive house of cards on a foundation of pure entitlement. I took a sip of my coffee, relishing the quiet atmosphere of my penthouse. The irony was absolutely delicious. Terrence was furious about my lack of responsibility while Ashley was promising him the world. Neither of them realized that the ground beneath their designer shoes was already crumbling. I leaned back in my chair, ready to watch their beautiful, arrogant illusion shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Back at the suburban house, Ashley paced the hardwood floors of the formal living room. Her mind was racing with grand ideas for her upcoming 5-year wedding anniversary. Terrence sat on the velvet sofa polishing his expensive leather dress shoes. He was a tall, imposing African-American man who always dressed like he was about to close a $1 million real estate deal. He looked at Ashley and reminded her that his entire extended family was flying in from Chicago for this event. His parents and his uncle owned several successful businesses. They expected a certain caliber of luxury. Terrence had spent the last 5 years bragging to his relatives about marrying into an established, wealthy family. He told them his father-in-law, Richard, was a massive financial titan. Ashley knew she had to deliver a flawless, upscale gala to maintain that perfect illusion. Terrence told her that this party needed to be absolutely flawless. He said they could not look like they were cutting corners, and that his family expected a country club atmosphere. Ashley smiled brightly and assured him it would be the social event of the season. Inside her chest, a tight knot of anxiety formed. She had absolutely no money of her own. Her influencer lifestyle generated zero actual income, and Terrence had not earned a commission check in 14 months. She needed a massive amount of cash immediately. Ashley walked into the home office where her father, Richard, was sitting behind his mahogany desk, pretending to read a financial magazine. She poured him a glass of expensive scotch and sat on the leather armchair opposite his desk. She knew exactly how to play his ego. She praised his business acumen and talked about how much Terrence respected his wealth and status. Richard puffed out his chest, soaking up the flattery like a dry sponge. Then Ashley dropped the number. She told him she needed exactly $50,000 to host the anniversary party in the backyard. Richard coughed loudly, nearly choking on his drink. He immediately started to sweat and protest, claiming his liquid assets were currently tied up in complex overseas investments. Just then, Terrence strolled into the office holding a golf club he had borrowed from the garage. He clapped Richard on the shoulder, calling him the patriarch of success. Terrence mentioned how excited his wealthy uncle was to finally see the famous estate and experience Richard's legendary high society hospitality. The sheer force of Richard's fragile ego completely overrode his basic common sense. He could not look poor in front of his arrogant son-in-law. He could not let Terrence know that he was technically bankrupt and that his oldest daughter owned the roof over their heads. Richard forced a booming, confident laugh. He looked at Terrence and told him that money was absolutely no object when it came to his favorite daughter. Richard opened the top drawer of his desk. He pulled out the heavy metal platinum credit card. It was the supplementary card linked directly to my primary financial account. For the past 4 years, I had paid the massive balance on that exact card every single month without fail. Richard handed the card to Ashley with a dramatic theatrical flourish. He told her to spare absolutely no expense and to show Terrence's family exactly how they did things in this exclusive neighborhood. Ashley snatched the card, her eyes gleaming with intense greed. She kissed her father on the cheek, grabbed her designer purse, and rushed out the door. 2 hours later, Ashley strutted into the pristine marble lobby of Prestige Events. It was an elite party planning boutique located in the most expensive commercial district of the city. The boutique catered strictly to high-net-worth individuals and local celebrities. Ashley sat down in a plush chair across from the lead coordinator. She was a sharp woman in an impeccable white suit holding a digital tablet. Ashley ordered a glass of complimentary champagne and began listing her outrageous demands. She wanted imported white orchids cascading down the patio columns of the house. She demanded a 5-course plated dinner featuring Wagyu beef and butter-poached lobster. She insisted on hiring a live 10-piece string orchestra and a custom laser light show that would project her and Terrence's initials onto the facade of the estate. The coordinator tapped the details into her tablet, maintaining a polite professional smile. She calculated the figures and informed Ashley that the total estimated cost would be slightly over $50,000. She also stated that their strict company policy required a 20% non-refundable deposit upfront before they would reserve the date or contact any premium vendors. That meant $10,000 was due immediately upon signing the contract. Ashley did not even flinch. She felt a surge of absolute power and undeniable superiority as she reached into her purse. She casually tossed the heavy platinum card onto the glass table. She told the coordinator to go ahead and run it for the initial $10,000. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs and taking a slow, victorious sip of her champagne. She was already visualizing the jealous comments on her social media feed. She was already picturing Terrence looking at her with pride when his family arrived at the spectacular gala. The coordinator picked up the heavy card and inserted the chip into the sleek, wireless payment terminal. The machine processed the transaction for a few seconds. A sharp, harsh error tone beeped loudly in the quiet, pristine room. The coordinator frowned slightly and pulled the card out. She wiped the chip carefully on her sleeve and inserted it again. The machine processed. Another sharp beep echoed through the boutique. The coordinator looked at the screen and then looked up at Ashley. Her professional, welcoming smile faltered slightly. "I am so sorry," the coordinator said, sliding the terminal across the glass table. "The payment will not go through." Ashley scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated annoyance. She insisted that the machine must be broken or experiencing a network glitch. She told the woman in a condescending tone that there was a limitless spending threshold on that platinum account because her father was extremely wealthy. The coordinator did not argue. She simply turned the digital screen toward Ashley so she could read the glowing red text herself. The message on the display was not a machine error. It was a direct automated response from the banking institution. The bright red letters displayed a very clear, unmistakable message. Card declined. Ashley felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. She snatched the card off the table, her hands suddenly trembling. She stammered a pathetic excuse about fraud protection security alerts and rushed out of the boutique, leaving her half-empty glass of champagne behind. The illusion of her endless wealth had just hit a solid brick wall. The platinum card her father had handed her with such supreme confidence was completely useless. As she stood on the bustling city sidewalk, gripping the worthless piece of plastic, she had no idea that this was only the very first domino to fall in the absolute destruction of her perfect fake life. Ashley sped back to the suburban house in a state of absolute hysteria. She slammed the heavy oak front door and marched straight into the formal living room where her mother Linda was busy arranging imported flowers. Ashley threw the useless platinum card onto the glass coffee table. She screamed that she had been utterly humiliated in front of the city's most elite event coordinator. She shrieked about how Terrence would react if he found out they could not afford the luxurious catering his wealthy African-American family expected. Richard rushed out of his home office, his face pale and confused. He picked up the card and insisted there must be a banking error. He claimed his financial credit was flawless. Linda, however, immediately knew exactly who was responsible for this inconvenience. Her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. She did not see a severe financial crisis. She saw an act of deliberate rebellion from the older daughter she viewed as nothing more than a convenient servant. Linda grabbed her smartphone, her manicured fingers tapping the digital screen with aggressive force. Miles away in my serene downtown penthouse, I was finishing a complex risk assessment matrix for my international auditing client. My phone vibrated on the marble island. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I did not answer. I simply watched the screen light up and ring, until it eventually rolled over to the automated voicemail system. A small notification icon popped up a minute later, indicating a new voice message. I pressed play and placed the phone on loudspeaker. Linda's voice blasted through the quiet luxury of my kitchen. Her tone was completely unhinged, stripping away any illusion of maternal affection. "What kind of sick game are you playing right now?" she shrieked through the speaker. "I just had a terrified Ashley come home crying because her card was declined at the event planner's office. You open that account back up right this second, do you hear me?" You are acting like a spoiled brat just because you do not have a successful husband to celebrate an anniversary with. You want to ruin your sister's big day because you are nothing but a jealous, bitter failure. You need to fix this immediately before Terrence finds out and realizes how incredibly selfish you are. Turn the card back on, and do not bother coming home until you are ready to apologize to your sister for your ridiculous behavior. The audio message ended with a loud, aggressive click. I stood completely still, the absolute silence of my penthouse returning. A lesser person might have cried. A weaker daughter might have felt the familiar sting of rejection and rushed to transfer funds to buy back their fake love. But the woman standing in this pristine kitchen was a senior financial auditor who had just permanently removed her emotional blinders. Her toxic words did not hurt me. They validated every single business decision I had made over the past 24 hours. I picked up my phone and tapped the export button on the audio file. I saved the recording to a secure encrypted cloud folder labeled Legal Evidence. It was a perfect admission of their profound entitlement and absolute financial dependency. They honestly believed they had the fundamental right to demand my hard-earned money to fund a party for a man who had not earned a legitimate paycheck in over a year. I walked over to my home office setup and opened my secure laptop. I bypassed my personal banking applications and logged directly into the administrative corporate portal for Titan Holdings LLC. This was the corporate entity I had created 4 years ago to save them from living on the harsh streets. I pulled up the property management dashboard. For 48 consecutive months, I had manually entered a $0 rent charge for the sprawling suburban estate. I navigated to the billing settings and adjusted the financial parameters. I entered the fair market rental value for a 5-bedroom luxury home in that specific upscale zip code. The monthly figure came out to exactly $6,000. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my property management broker. He answered on the second ring with his usual crisp, professional tone. I did not waste any time with casual, friendly greetings. I instructed him to immediately generate a formal notice of past due rent for the current tenants occupying the suburban property under Titan Holdings. I told him to draft a legal letter stating that the extended grace period for free occupancy had officially expired. The tenants owed $6,000 for the current month, and the payment was due immediately upon receipt of the document. I specifically requested that the document be printed on the official corporate letterhead of the management firm, ensuring my personal name was nowhere to be found on the intimidating paperwork. The broker confirmed the strict instructions and asked if he should send the letter via standard postal mail. I smiled, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, bathed in the afternoon sun. I told him standard mail was entirely too slow for this particular transaction. I instructed him to use a registered corporate courier service, requiring a direct physical signature upon delivery. I wanted to make absolutely certain that Richard and Linda received the heavy legal envelope directly into their own hands. They wanted to scream about my jealousy and aggressively demand access to my bank accounts. They were completely blinded by their own stunning arrogance. I ended the call and closed my laptop, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. My mother thought a declined credit card was the ultimate disaster of her day. She had absolutely no idea that the real financial earthquake was already printed, sealed, and currently speeding toward her front door. The heavy oak front door of the suburban estate echoed with a series of sharp, aggressive knocks. Richard was sitting in the formal living room, sipping his morning coffee and reading a golf magazine. He frowned at the interruption. He set his porcelain cup down and walked lazily toward the entryway. When he pulled the door open, he found a uniformed corporate courier standing on the pristine welcome mat. The man held an oversized, rigid cardboard envelope and a digital signature pad. The courier asked for Richard by his full legal name and stated that a direct signature was strictly required for the delivery. Richard puffed out his chest, adjusting the collar of his expensive cashmere sweater. He grabbed the electronic pen and scribbled his name on the screen, feeling a surge of self-importance. He assumed the heavy document was simply another prospectus from a wealth management firm begging for his non-existent investment capital. As the courier turned to leave, the regular postal worker walked up the driveway and handed Richard a thick stack of standard mail. Richard carried the entire pile of envelopes into his home office and tossed them onto his polished mahogany desk. He sat down in his leather executive chair and began sorting through the daily delivery. He noticed several envelopes bearing the logos of the local municipal utility companies. Richard felt a slight prickle of annoyance. He had not looked at a utility bill in over 4 years. He completely forgot what they even looked like, because Emma had always handled the mundane administrative tasks of the household. He grabbed a silver letter opener and sliced through the first envelope. It was the electricity bill. Richard unfolded the paper, and his eyes widened in absolute shock. The total amount due was printed in bold red ink. It demanded a payment of $840. Right below the total, a glaring warning stated that the account was severely past due and the automatic payment method had been permanently rejected. Richard quickly slashed open the second envelope from the county water and sewage department. The result was exactly the same. The automatic draft had failed, and the past due balance included hefty late fees. His hands began to tremble slightly. He could not understand why the banking systems were suddenly malfunctioning. He pushed the utility bills aside and reached for the thick cardboard envelope delivered by the courier. He tore the tab and pulled out a crisp stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. At the very top of the page, a bold, sophisticated logo read, Titan Holdings, LLC. Richard scanned the first paragraph and his confusion rapidly morphed into a deep, suffocating panic. The document was a formal legal demand for past due rent. It explicitly stated that the extended grace period for free occupancy at this specific address had officially expired. The corporate property management firm was demanding an immediate payment of $6,000 for the current month. The letter clearly identified Richard and Linda as the current tenants of the property. Richard stared at the word tenants. His brain completely short-circuited. He read the sentence 3 times, but the words refused to make sense in his arrogant mind. He genuinely believed he was the sole legal owner of the estate. 4 years ago, when the bank was threatening to throw them on the street, Emma had handed him a massive stack of rescue paperwork to sign. He had been so relieved to avoid the social humiliation of foreclosure that he had blindly signed every single page without reading a single clause. He had convinced himself that Emma simply restructured his mortgage. The name Titan Holdings meant absolutely nothing to him. Richard shouted for his wife, his voice cracked with a mixture of fear and outrage. Linda marched into the office wearing a silk dressing gown and looking deeply irritated by the sudden noise. Richard shoved the stack of papers across the desk toward her. He pointed a shaking finger at the red warning labels on the utility bills and the terrifying legal demand from the property management firm. He babbled frantically about a massive banking error and a scam company trying to steal their home. Linda picked up the papers and read them with a harsh scowl. Unlike Richard, she did not feel panic. She only felt a blinding self-righteous anger toward her older daughter. Linda threw the papers back onto the desk with a loud, dramatic scoff. She told Richard to stop hyperventilating over a stupid temper tantrum. She explicitly blamed Emma for the entire situation. Linda declared that Emma was purposely canceling the utility payments just to cause unnecessary drama and punish them for Ashley's upcoming anniversary party. Linda completely dismissed the rent demand from Titan Holdings. She arrogantly told Richard that it was probably just junk mail or some ridiculous administrative error from when Emma helped them refinance the house years ago. She insisted that Emma was sitting in a cheap hotel somewhere waiting for them to beg her to come back. Linda instructed her husband to completely ignore the bills. She confidently stated that Emma would eventually realize how pathetic she was acting and would crawl back to turn the credit cards on and pay the balances like she always did. She grabbed Richard by the arm and dragged him out of the office, demanding he pour her a drink to calm her nerves. The mahogany desk sat empty for exactly 10 minutes. The heavy legal document demanding $6,000 in rent remained perfectly centered on the polished wood. The office door slowly creaked open. Terrence slipped into the room holding his smartphone. The tall African-American man was looking for a quiet, isolated space to pretend he was negotiating a massive commercial property deal. He paced around the room practicing his fake corporate vocabulary. As he walked past the desk, his eyes casually scanned the scattered paperwork. Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. He was a licensed real estate broker. Even though he was completely unsuccessful and had not closed a deal in over a year, he absolutely knew how to read property documents. He recognized the exact formatting of a formal eviction warning and a corporate rent demand. He leaned over the desk and read the name, Titan Holdings, LLC. He read the monthly rental amount of $6,000. He read the section that legally identified his wealthy father-in-law as a mere tenant. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Terrence picked up the paper to make sure his eyes were not deceiving him. For 5 years, he had been parading around his extended family, bragging about marrying into generational wealth. He had endured Ashley's relentless spending habits because he firmly believed he was next in line to inherit a massive real estate empire. He looked at the past due utility bills sitting next to the rent demand. The pristine, flawless illusion of his rich suburban in-laws shattered instantly. They did not own this estate. They were renting it. They were actually drowning in debt and could not even afford their own electricity. Terrence slowly lowered the paper back onto the desk. A dark, heavy suspicion began to consume his mind. He pulled out his phone and stared at the blank screen, completely rethinking every single word his wife had ever told him. Terrence gripped the thick corporate paper in his right hand. He stormed up the grand curved staircase and pushed open the heavy double doors to the master suite. Ashley was sitting at her illuminated vanity, applying a fresh coat of expensive lip gloss for her next social media post. He walked directly up behind her and slammed the Titan Holdings rent demand onto the mirrored surface. He demanded to know exactly what he was looking at. He pointed a shaking finger at the bold corporate logo and the $6,000 past due balance. He asked his wife why her allegedly wealthy father was receiving an aggressive eviction warning for a property they supposedly owned outright. Ashley glanced down at the legal document. Her heart skipped a frantic, terrifying beat, but her face remained a mask of absolute cosmetic perfection. She had spent her entire 30 years watching her parents lie to maintain their fragile social status, and she had inherited their terrifying ability to deceive without a single flinch. She let out a loud theatrical laugh and tossed her lip gloss aside. She stood up, wrapping her manicured arms around Terrence's neck. She told him he was being completely paranoid over a stupid administrative mistake. She smoothly explained that her father utilized a highly complex network of corporate shell companies for tax mitigation purposes, and Titan Holdings was simply one of his many private financial entities. She claimed the property management firm just sent an automated notice to the wrong mailing address because of a clerical error at the downtown office. Terrence narrowed his eyes, searching her perfectly contoured face for any sign of deception. Ashley stroked his lapel and looked deep into his eyes. She promised him with absolute conviction that her parents were incredibly wealthy, and that this massive suburban estate would eventually be signed over to them free and clear. She leaned in close and whispered that the only real problem in their family was her older sister. She painted Emma as a bitter, jealous failure who had completely lost her mind and run away from home. She claimed Emma was throwing a massive temper tantrum and trying to sabotage their upcoming anniversary party out of pure spite because she was a pathetic spinster who could not find a man to marry her. Terrence slowly exhaled, relaxing his tense, broad shoulders. He forced a warm, convincing smile and kissed his wife gently on the forehead. He told her he was just stressed about his upcoming commercial real estate deals and apologized for doubting her family's wealth. Ashley beamed, kissing him back before returning to her vanity chair to finish her makeup routine. But as Terrence walked into his massive walk-in closet to change his tailored suit, his mind was spinning rapidly. He was a licensed real estate professional. Even though he was failing miserably, he absolutely knew how the industry worked. He knew that corporate shell companies did not accidentally send aggressive eviction threats to their primary beneficiaries. He grabbed his laptop and retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the door silently behind him. He opened a private, secure browser window and navigated straight to the county property appraiser database. He typed in the address of the suburban estate. He bypassed the basic public search and pulled the full historical transaction record. The screen loaded a highly detailed legal timeline. 4 years ago, the property had entered active bank foreclosure status. 2 months after the foreclosure notice, a massive cash transaction cleared the debt, and the deed was officially transferred from Richard and Linda to Titan Holdings LLC. He searched the corporate registry for the state. The registered agent for Titan Holdings was a premier downtown law firm. The true owner was hidden behind layers of strict corporate privacy shields. But Terrence knew one thing for absolute certain. Richard did not own this house. Ashley was lying straight to his face. He closed the laptop, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. He realized he was trapped on a rapidly sinking ship, and he needed an exit strategy immediately. 3 days passed in a state of tense, suffocating denial. Richard and Linda continued to ignore the mounting pile of utility notices, completely convinced that Emma would magically cave to their silent treatment. They went about their days lounging by the pool and aggressively discussing the lavish catering menu for Ashley's upcoming anniversary gala. It happened on a warm, humid Thursday evening. Linda was in the custom kitchen blending a large pitcher of expensive margaritas, while Richard watched a golf tournament on the massive 85-inch television in the living room. Ashley was upstairs adjusting her professional ring light for another live broadcast to her followers. Without a single warning flicker, the entire estate plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The massive television died instantly. The loud blender ground to a sudden halt. The constant soothing hum of the central air conditioning completely silenced. Ashley shrieked from the second floor, stumbling blindly down the dark staircase. Richard yelled in pure frustration, dropping his remote control onto the floor. He assumed a local transformer had blown out in the neighborhood. He marched to the front window and angrily pulled back the heavy custom drapes. The streetlights outside were glowing brightly. The neighbors' sprawling houses across the manicured lawns were brilliantly illuminated. The only house sitting in complete oppressive darkness was theirs. The electric company had officially cut the power. Panic finally breached the thick, impenetrable walls of Linda's delusion. She stumbled through the dark kitchen, frantically searching the countertops for her smartphone. The battery icon was glowing red at 15%. The harsh reality of their financial starvation hit her with the force of a freight train. She could not call Emma. Emma had permanently blocked their numbers and ignored their hateful voicemails. They had zero cash in their accounts. Their premium credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. The heavy summer heat was already beginning to creep into the stagnant air of the house. Linda locked herself in the downstairs powder room to escape Richard's panicked shouting. She stood in the pitch-black bathroom, her chest heaving with deeply humiliated rage. She opened her contacts and dialed the one person she despised, asking for help. The phone rang twice before her sister Carol answered. Linda forced a bright, cheerful tone, desperately masking the absolute panic in her shaking voice. She casually asked Carol for a quick temporary loan of $2,000. Linda lied beautifully, claiming that their primary bank was experiencing a massive catastrophic system error and all their executive accounts were temporarily frozen for security purposes. She promised to pay Carol back with interest by Monday morning. She stood in the dark, gripping her glowing phone, waiting in absolute terror to see if her final pathetic lie would save them from total ruin. The $2,000 from Aunt Carol arrived via wire transfer the next morning. It was barely enough to cover the aggressive reconnection fees, the late penalties, and the basic past-due utility balances. By noon, the heavy hum of the central air conditioning returned to the suburban estate, and the massive televisions glowed back to life. Linda walked through the house, acting as if she had single-handedly conquered a minor administrative glitch. She poured herself a fresh glass of chilled white wine and told everyone to stop worrying. But the suffocating tension in the house did not dissipate. Ashley was pacing the hardwood floors, her designer heels clicking frantically. The elite event coordinator at Prestige Events had sent a final warning email. If the $10,000 deposit was not paid in full by the end of the week, the entire anniversary gala would be permanently canceled. Ashley threw a massive tantrum in the kitchen, screaming that Terrence was becoming highly suspicious of their financial delays. She demanded that her father fix the banking issue immediately, or she would be a laughingstock in front of her wealthy African American in-laws. Richard retreated to his mahogany home office and locked the heavy wooden door. The walls felt like they were rapidly closing in on him. His tailored shirt was sticking to his back with cold, nervous sweat. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the perception of limitless wealth and unchecked authority. The thought of walking out into the living room and confessing his absolute bankruptcy to his arrogant son-in-law was a fate worse than death. Richard sat heavily in his leather executive chair and stared at the polished wood surface. He needed cash. He needed a massive injection of liquid capital to fund Ashley's ridiculous party and keep the illusion alive for just a few more months. He opened the deep bottom drawer of his desk and began pulling out thick, dusty folders. He rummaged through years of disorganized financial records, tax returns, and outdated property assessments. His hands stopped on a heavy manila envelope from over a decade ago. It contained the original warranty deed and title insurance paperwork from when he and Linda had first purchased the suburban estate. Richard stared at the official county seals and the fancy legal typography. In his profoundly arrogant and legally illiterate mind, he convinced himself that these old papers were still valid proof of ownership. He completely ignored the reality that the bank had foreclosed on him 4 years ago, and that Emma had legally transferred the asset to Titan Holdings, LLC. Richard formulated a wildly reckless and highly illegal plan. He decided to apply for a home equity line of credit. He knew local credit unions were currently offering expedited approvals for wealthy homeowners looking to tap into their property equity. If he could just secure a fast $60,000 bridge loan, he could pay the aggressive event planners, silence his demanding daughter, and maintain his fabricated status as the wealthy patriarch. There was only one massive obstacle standing in his way. When Emma had rescued them from homelessness 4 years ago, she had forced Richard and Linda to sign a mountain of complex legal documents. Richard vaguely remembered that Emma had established herself as the primary financial guarantor to satisfy the strict banking regulators during the foreclosure crisis. He frantically dug deeper into the bottom drawer, tossing aside old country club bills and empty cigar boxes. He finally found a specific legal document from the restructuring phase. It was an old expired power of attorney form. It explicitly granted Emma the absolute legal authority to manage, encumber, or modify the financial obligations tied to the residential property. Richard read the fine print. The local credit union would undoubtedly require Emma's direct authorization to approve a new line of credit against the estate. Richard pulled a fresh blue ink pen from his expensive desk set. He placed the old power of attorney document next to a blank standardized loan application form he had printed from the internet. He stared at Emma's elegant, precise signature at the bottom of the old page. The air in the locked office grew thick and heavy. Richard was about to cross a terrifying line from simple financial mismanagement directly into federal felony territory. He convinced himself that he was doing this out of pure necessity to protect his family. He rationalized that Emma would eventually calm down and approve the loan retroactively once she realized how important the anniversary gala was to her younger sister. He gripped the pen tightly, steadying his shaking hand. He carefully traced the fluid loops and sharp angles of his oldest daughter's name onto the bottom line of the fresh bank application. He signed Emma's name perfectly. He then added his own signature right next to the blatant forgery, solidifying his massive financial crime. An hour later, Richard drove his leased luxury sedan into the parking lot of a prestigious regional credit union. He walked through the sliding glass doors, projecting an aura of absolute supreme confidence. He wore his finest custom-tailored suit, a silk tie, and an expensive watch he had not finished paying off. He asked to speak directly with the senior branch manager. Richard sat in a plush leather chair in a private glass-walled office and delivered the performance of his lifetime. He spoke loudly and arrogantly about his expansive investment portfolio and his desire to quickly access some liquid equity for minor home renovations. He smoothly slid the heavy folder across the polished desk. It contained the outdated property deed, the fabricated income statements, and the freshly forged authorization documents. The senior branch manager smiled, politely impressed by Richard's loud, booming confidence and his expensive attire. The manager quickly reviewed the paperwork, noting the high appraised value of the suburban estate in the current housing market. He told Richard that the initial application looked incredibly strong and that the underwriting department would process the documents for an expedited preliminary approval. Richard stood up, shook the manager's hand firmly, and walked out of the bank, feeling like an absolute genius. He smiled as he walked to his car, completely certain that he had just single-handedly saved his family from total social ruin. He had absolutely no idea that his forged signature had just triggered a silent digital alarm in a highly secure financial system explicitly designed to destroy him. High above the bustling downtown streets, the silence of my penthouse was suddenly broken by a sharp, distinct chime from my secure encrypted smartphone. I was sitting at my glass dining table, reviewing an international merger portfolio, when the notification flashed across the screen. As a senior financial auditor handling massive corporate accounts, I never left anything to chance. My personal and corporate financial security protocols were impenetrable. I had installed top-tier credit monitoring software and automated fraud alerts on every single asset I owned. I picked up the phone and opened the secure banking application. A bright red banner dominated the digital dashboard. The alert was generated by a major credit bureau flagging a hard inquiry on my primary identification number and the corporate tax identification number registered to Titan Holdings, LLC. The inquiry originated from a well-known regional credit union. My eyes scanned the detailed digital report. Someone had just initiated an aggressive application for a $60,000 home equity line of credit using the exact address of the suburban estate. A cold, calculated smile touched the corners of my mouth. Richard had actually done it. My arrogant, foolish father had crossed the hard, definitive line from simple financial incompetence straight into a federal felony. He genuinely thought he could outsmart the banking system. He believed he could quietly extract tens of thousands of dollars from a property he lost to foreclosure 4 years ago. He was operating under the pathetic delusion that his tailored suits and loud voice could bypass modern financial regulations. I did not panic. I did not feel an ounce of the anxiety that would normally cripple a victim of identity theft. I simply went to work. This was my absolute domain. I closed my merger portfolio and opened a fresh encrypted workspace on my dual monitors. I immediately dialed the direct extension of my dedicated corporate relationship manager at the commercial bank that held the Titan Holdings accounts. I bypassed the automated system and spoke directly to the executive fraud department. I clearly and calmly informed the banking executive that an unauthorized individual was attempting to leverage a corporate asset using fraudulent documents. Because I am the sole registered owner and the absolute legal guarantor for Titan Holdings, the bank treated my fraud report as a critical Tier 1 priority. Within 15 minutes, their internal security team intercepted the electronic application from the regional credit union. The credit union, eager to avoid any liability in a massive corporate fraud scheme, fully cooperated with my banking team. They securely transmitted a complete digital copy of the exact loan application my father had submitted just an hour earlier. I downloaded the heavy PDF file and opened it on my large high-definition monitor. I zoomed in on the final page of the document. There, sitting right next to Richard's sloppy, rushed handwriting, was my own name. I stared at the signature. It was an incredibly pathetic attempt at a forgery. Richard had tried to replicate the fluid loops and sharp angles of my professional signature, but the digital scan clearly showed the hesitation and the nervous pressure of his pen. He had attached a completely outdated and legally void power of attorney form from 4 years ago, hoping the loan officer would be too intimidated by his fake wealth to verify the dates. He had essentially handed me the loaded weapon I needed to destroy his entire fabricated universe. I stood up from my desk and walked over to my heavy commercial-grade laser printer. I began printing every single piece of evidence. I printed the forged loan application on high-quality paper. I printed the time-stamped digital logs provided by the credit union, which explicitly detailed the exact time Richard sat in their branch and the specific loan officer he handed the fraudulent documents to. I walked over to my personal safe and retrieved the original notarized property deed that proved Titan Holdings owned the estate free and clear. I pulled the initial foreclosure paperwork that proved Richard and Linda possessed absolutely zero equity in the home. I returned to the glass table and began assembling the most devastating financial dossier of my entire career. I was methodical and completely emotionless. I placed a certified copy of my genuine notarized signature right next to Richard's desperate forgery, highlighting the glaring discrepancies with a bright yellow marker. I compiled the past due utility bills, the ignored rent demand, and the new fraudulent loan application into a flawless chronological timeline. It was a perfect, irrefutable narrative of a desperate man committing bank fraud to fund a ridiculous backyard party for his ungrateful daughter. I placed every single document into a sleek black leather portfolio. I smoothed my hands over the cool leather feeling, the absolute crushing weight of the evidence I now held. In the eyes of the federal banking system and the local authorities, there was absolutely no gray area here. There was no room for my mother to manipulate the truth or cry about family loyalty. This was black and white criminal fraud. Richard had effectively signed his own arrest warrant just to keep up appearances for his unemployed son-in-law. I picked up my phone and dialed my aggressive corporate attorney. I instructed him to prepare the final phase of our operation. I told him to draft a formal legal complaint for identity theft and wire fraud, but to hold off on filing it with the local police department just yet. I wanted to handle the initial execution of this strike personally. I wanted to look them directly in the eyes when their fake wealthy world shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and began selecting my outfit for the upcoming weekend. I bypassed the casual clothes and went straight for a sharp-tailored charcoal gray power suit. I picked out my most expensive designer heels. I was not going to show up to their lunch looking like the exhausted older sister they constantly belittled. I was going to arrive looking like the wealthy, powerful corporate executive who completely owned them. The trap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were open, and Richard had just blindly placed his head right in the center. All I had to do now was show up and pull the lever. The restaurant was called the Monarch. It was a notoriously exclusive establishment downtown, known for its imported caviar and months-long waiting list. Richard and Linda had secured a large round table right in the center of the main dining room to ensure maximum visibility for their grand performance. They were hosting Terrence's parents, who had flown in from Chicago for the weekend. Terrence's mother and father were upper-middle-class business owners who deeply valued social standing and highly respected old money. Richard was currently holding court at the head of the table, swirling a glass of expensive red wine and loudly boasting about his fictitious real estate investment portfolio. Linda sat next to him, wearing a brand-new designer dress she had undoubtedly purchased with borrowed cash, playing the role of the gracious, wealthy matriarch. Ashley and Terrence were leaning in, completely absorbed in the illusion, projecting the image of a young power couple destined to inherit a massive suburban empire. Terrence's father leaned forward, cutting into a thick prime steak, and complimented Richard on his beautiful, sprawling estate. He mentioned how excited the entire Chicago family was to attend the upcoming 5-year anniversary gala in the backyard. Richard beamed with absolute arrogant pride, completely ignoring the fact that his electricity had been cut off just days prior, and that he had begged Aunt Carol for a sudden bailout. He assured his in-laws that the party would be the absolute social event of the entire season, and that money was absolutely no object when it came to his favorite daughter. Linda smiled sweetly and patted Terrence's arm, telling his parents that they treated him like their own biological son. They were all drowning in a spectacular ocean of debt and lies, but in that specific moment, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and hovering waiters, they felt totally invincible. The heavy glass doors of the Monarch opened, and I stepped into the opulent dining room. I was not the exhausted, overwhelmed auditor they were used to exploiting and insulting. I wore the charcoal gray power suit I had meticulously selected, perfectly tailored to project absolute authority and ruthless precision. My designer heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, commanding immediate attention from the staff and nearby patrons. Walking right beside me was my corporate attorney David, a man who charged $800 an hour and looked like a legal shark hunting for blood. We bypassed the hostess stand, entirely ignoring the waiter who tried to ask for our reservation. My eyes were locked directly on the center table where my biological family was currently selling their fraudulent fairy tale to their unsuspecting guests. As I navigated through the maze of white tablecloths, Terrence was the first person to notice my approach. His confident smile immediately faltered, and his rigid posture stiffened. He nudged Ashley, who turned her head and gasped quietly, bringing a manicured hand to her mouth in genuine shock. Richard and Linda followed her terrified gaze. The blood instantly drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. The expensive red wine in his glass sloshed dangerously as his hand began to tremble uncontrollably. My mother, however, immediately switched into defensive survival mode. Her eyes narrowed into angry slits as she registered my powerful, unbothered appearance. She had spent the last week telling everyone I was a pathetic runaway who could not handle the real world, and seeing me look this wealthy and untouchable completely shattered her carefully constructed narrative. I stopped right at the edge of their table. David stood silently at my left shoulder, an imposing figure of legal dread, holding a sleek black briefcase. Terrence's parents looked up at me with polite confusion, clearly unaware of who I was or why I was interrupting their expensive lunch. The tension hovering over the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. I did not say a single greeting. I simply looked at Richard, watching the sheer terror bloom in his wide, panicked eyes. He knew exactly why I was there. He knew that I worked as a senior auditor in corporate finance, and he knew he had forged my name on a federal banking document less than 24 hours ago. Linda slammed her linen napkin onto the table and stood up forcefully. She forced a tight, highly unnatural smile for the benefit of Terrence's parents before turning her vicious, glaring eyes directly onto me. She leaned across the table and hissed in a harsh, angry whisper, demanding to know what I was doing there. She accused me of tracking them down just to cause unnecessary drama and humiliate the family in front of their important guests. She aggressively ordered me to turn around and walk out the door, claiming we could discuss my childish temper tantrum back at the house later that evening. She tried to dismiss me like a disobedient toddler completely desperate to maintain her elegant facade in front of her wealthy in-laws. She explicitly told me that I was ruining her perfectly planned afternoon and that I needed to stop acting like a jealous, bitter spinster trying to ruin Ashley's happiness. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink or show a single ounce of emotion. I completely ignored her frantic emotional manipulation and gaslighting. I looked directly past my mother and focused my eyes entirely on Richard. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles were turning white, and cold sweat was beading on his forehead. I slowly lifted my right arm and brought the sleek black leather portfolio forward. I unzipped the top and pulled out the thick stack of legal and financial documents I had prepared the night before. Without a single word of hesitation, I dropped the heavy dossier right into the dead center of the pristine white tablecloth. The papers landed with a loud, distinct thud, rattling the expensive crystal water glasses and completely halting the conversation at the surrounding tables. Right on top, facing Terrence and his parents, was the fraudulent loan application featuring Richard's sloppy forged signature right next to my own perfectly printed name. The stark, undeniable evidence of his felony sat under the bright dining room lights, completely exposing the absolute lie they had been living. I stood tall and unwavering, watching the absolute horror wash over my father, as he realized there was no escape from the legal trap he had blindly walked into. The sound of the heavy leather portfolio hitting the table seemed to echo endlessly in the silent dining room. Linda immediately lunged forward. Her manicured hands reached out to snatch the documents away from the center of the table. She let out a high-pitched, forced laugh that sounded completely unhinged. She frantically told Terrence and his parents that this was just a silly practical joke and that her older daughter had a terrible sense of humor. Before her fingers could even brush the crisp white paper, David stepped forward. My attorney smoothly placed his large hand firmly over the dossier. He looked at my mother with a deadpan expression and advised her not to tamper with physical evidence of a federal crime. Linda froze in her tracks. The fake smile violently collapsed off her face. I turned my attention away from my panicking mother and looked directly at Terrence and his wealthy parents. They were sitting completely frozen in their plush dining chairs. Terrence's father had actually dropped his steak knife onto his china plate. I introduced myself with absolute perfect enunciation. I told them my name was Emma, and that I was the senior financial auditor they had likely never heard about. I apologized for interrupting their expensive lunch, but stated that I felt a moral obligation to protect them from a massive financial scam. I looked Terrence straight in the eyes. I told him that the sprawling suburban estate he had been bragging about all afternoon did not belong to Richard or Linda. I stated clearly and loudly that the house your son is living in belongs entirely to my company, Titan Holdings LLC. I informed the entire table that Richard and Linda had gone totally bankrupt 4 years ago, and I had bought the house out of foreclosure to save them from living on the street. Ashley let out a loud, dramatic gasp. She slammed her hands on the table and yelled that I was a bitter, jealous liar. She grabbed Terrence by the arm and desperately begged him not to listen to my toxic delusions. Terrence did not look at her. He kept his dark eyes locked entirely on my face. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. He asked me in a low, dangerous voice if I had absolute proof of these claims. I nodded to David. My attorney calmly opened the portfolio and slid the certified property deed and the eviction notice directly across the table toward Terrence and his father. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried over the soft jazz music playing in the background of the restaurant. I announced that not only did they not own the house, but they had also failed to pay their rent for the past 2 months. I revealed that their electricity had been shut off just days prior and that they were currently drowning in insurmountable debt. I watched as Terrence read the official eviction warning. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The wealthy, established family he thought he had married into was nothing more than a pathetic, broke mirage. Then I turned my absolute focus onto my father. Richard was sinking lower and lower into his chair, looking like he was about to experience a massive cardiac event. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I did not give him a single second to recover. I pointed directly at the top document sitting in the dossier. I told the entire table that being broke was not a crime, but what Richard did yesterday absolutely was. I declared clearly that Richard had just committed a federal offense. I explained that he had walked into a regional credit union and attempted to take out a $60,000 home equity line of credit on a house he did not own. Linda shrieked, demanding that I stop talking. She tried to play the victim card, crying out that I was destroying my own father over a simple misunderstanding. She looked desperately at Terrence's parents, claiming that families go through rough patches and that I was just a vindictive child seeking attention. I ignored her completely. I looked Richard dead in the eyes and delivered the final fatal blow. I stated that in order to push the loan application through, he had blatantly forged my legal signature on the banking documents. I explained that my credit monitoring software had flagged his illegal activity immediately. I told him that the bank had already handed over the time-stamped security footage and the fraudulent paperwork. I made it absolutely clear that identity theft and wire fraud carried severe mandatory prison sentences. David chimed in with his booming authoritative voice. He informed Richard that the local authorities and the Federal Banking Commission had already been notified of the breach. He stated that attempting to defraud a federally insured institution was a felony that no amount of suburban country club charm could fix. Richard buried his face in his hands. He let out a pathetic whimpering sound, completely broken by the inescapable weight of his own profound stupidity. He did not deny the accusations, because the evidence sitting right in front of him was mathematically and legally absolute. Terrence's mother brought a trembling hand to her pearl necklace. She looked at Linda with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The wealthy Chicago business owners had built their lives on hard work and integrity. Finding out they were sitting across from broke, manipulative criminals was the ultimate insult. Terrence's father slowly stood up from the table, throwing his linen napkin down. He did not say a single word to Richard or Linda. The absolute silence from his side of the table was more punishing than any screaming match could ever be. I looked at Ashley. The golden child was trembling uncontrollably. Her designer dress suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous. She was staring at her husband, desperately searching for a lifeline, for a way to spin this disaster back into her favor. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but Terrence violently yanked his arm away. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The look in his eyes was terrifying. It was a mixture of absolute rage and profound humiliation. He realized that every single thing she had ever told him was a meticulously crafted lie. The illusion of Ashley's grand elite lifestyle officially shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the dining room floor. Terrence stood up so fast his heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the polished marble floor. He did not bother to pick it up. He did not look at his stunned parents, who were already gathering their coats to flee the humiliating scene. He did not even glance at Richard and Linda, who were sitting frozen like pathetic statues of shattered pride. Terrence reached down and grabbed Ashley firmly by the upper arm. His grip was tight and completely unforgiving. He hauled her out of her seat, ignoring her sudden panicked yelp. He dragged his frantic wife away from the table and marched directly toward the glass exit doors of the upscale restaurant. Ashley stumbled in her high designer heels, struggling to keep up with his aggressive, furious strides. She whimpered and begged him to slow down, but Terrence marched straight through the opulent lobby and burst out into the sweltering afternoon heat of the parking lot. He did not stop until they reached the far corner of the valet section, completely isolated from the prying eyes of the restaurant patrons and the whispering staff. He let go of her arm so abruptly that she nearly lost her balance and tumbled onto the hot asphalt. Terrence paced back and forth, his chest heaving with deep, furious breaths. He ran his hands over his closely shaved head, trying to process the absolute magnitude of the deception. For 5 long years he had endured her insufferable vanity and her constant demands for luxury. He had tolerated her arrogant parents and their condescending remarks. He did all of it because he truly believed he was securing a massive financial future. He thought he was building a real estate empire with the backing of a powerful, wealthy family. Now the terrifying truth was crashing down on him with the force of a falling building. He had married a broke, delusional woman whose family was about to face a federal judge for wire fraud and identity theft. He stopped pacing and glared at Ashley. His dark eyes were burning with a terrifying, intense rage. He demanded that she tell him the absolute truth for the first time in their entire marriage. He listed every single lie she had ever fed him. He yelled about the sprawling suburban estate she claimed they would inherit. He brought up the platinum credit cards that were actually funded by the older sister she constantly mocked and belittled. He pointed out the humiliating fact that his own respected Chicago business-owning parents had just witnessed her father being exposed as a desperate, pathetic criminal. Terrence realized out loud that the tens of thousands of dollars she had spent on designer clothes and lavish vacations were completely financed by the silent suffering of a sister she treated like garbage. He was shackled to a mountain of hidden debt, and a family destined for federal prison. Ashley panicked. The flawless cosmetic mask of the golden child completely melted away, revealing the terrified, manipulative core underneath. She burst into violent theatrical tears. She reached out with her manicured hands and tried to grab Terrence by the lapels of his suit, attempting to use the physical affection that had always blinded him before. She screamed that none of this was her fault. She shifted the entire blame onto Emma without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. Ashley shrieked that Emma was a bitter, jealous monster who had spent her entire life resenting her younger sister. She cried out that Emma engineered this entire public spectacle simply to ruin their upcoming 5-year anniversary gala. She sobbed wildly, claiming her parents only made a tiny financial mistake and that Emma was twisting a simple family loan into a massive federal crime just to be cruel and vindictive. Ashley begged Terrence to believe that she was the ultimate victim of a toxic older sister who could not stand to see her happy and deeply in love. She promised him that they could overcome this tiny setback and that her parents would somehow fix the banking issue by Monday morning if they just stuck together. Terrence stood perfectly still and stared at the crying woman standing in front of him. The loud, dramatic sobs and the desperate victim routine did not work anymore. The spell was completely broken. He looked at her expensive silk dress and her sparkling diamond anniversary ring. He realized every single thing she wore was stolen or borrowed. She had absolutely zero assets, zero income, and zero shame. She was perfectly willing to let her own sister pay for her entire luxurious existence while simultaneously trashing her name to anyone who would listen. She was not a wealthy heiress. She was a deeply pathetic parasite who refused to take accountability for her own actions. He stepped back, creating a cold, physical distance between them. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out the electronic key fob for his least luxury sedan. He pressed the unlock button, and the headlights flashed in the bright afternoon sun. Ashley stopped crying for a fraction of a second. She wiped a tear from her cheek and took a step toward the passenger side door, assuming he was finally ready to take her home and comfort her. Terrence opened the driver's side door and slid into the leather seat. He did not unlock the passenger doors. He started the engine and the powerful motor roared to life. Ashley pulled on the locked door handle, her face contorting in sudden fresh panic. She banged her palm against the tinted glass, demanding that he let her inside the vehicle. Terrence rolled down the window just a few inches. He looked at the woman he had called his wife for 5 years. He felt nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the final, absolute truth. "You are a fraud." He rolled the window up, shifted the car into drive, and slammed his foot on the gas pedal. He sped out of the restaurant parking lot, leaving Ashley completely abandoned, stranded on the hot asphalt in her stolen designer dress. I returned to the absolute tranquility of my downtown penthouse, leaving the catastrophic wreckage of my biological family behind at that upscale restaurant. David, my corporate attorney, had departed with a firm handshake and a promise to monitor the Federal Banking Commission portal for the official arrest warrant. I walked into my pristine kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the sprawling city skyline. The silence in my luxury apartment was beautiful and profound. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, terrifying reality my parents were currently facing. My encrypted smartphone had been vibrating relentlessly against the marble countertop for the past 45 minutes. The digital screen displayed a continuous stream of missed calls. They were all coming from Linda and Richard. I knew exactly what was happening on their end. The initial shock and aggressive anger they displayed at the restaurant had completely evaporated. The paralyzing fear of a federal criminal indictment had finally set in. They had likely rushed back to the dark, sweltering suburban estate with no electricity, no air conditioning, and absolutely no way out. They had exhausted their usual tactics of gaslighting and public intimidation. Now they were forced to deploy their absolute last resort: the desperate, pathetic victim routine. I picked up the phone and stared at the glowing screen. I did not want to speak to them, but as a senior financial auditor, I understood the immense value of capturing a full verbal confession. I opened a secondary digital recording application on my secure laptop and synchronized it with my mobile device. I tapped the green accept button and placed the phone flat on the cold marble island, turning the speakerphone volume to the maximum setting. I did not say a single word. I simply waited for them to fill the dead air. Emma, please do not hang up the phone. Linda's voice burst through the speaker instantly. She was crying with loud theatrical sobs that echoed through my quiet kitchen. The harsh, demanding tone she had used to humiliate me her entire life was completely gone. In its place was the trembling, high-pitched wail of a terrified woman who had just realized she was completely powerless. Emma, my sweet girl, please listen to me. I am so incredibly sorry. I am so sorry for everything. You have to understand that I was just stressed out. I was overwhelmed by the financial pressure, and I just misspoke. I leaned against the kitchen counter listening to her pathetic attempt to rewrite history. She was completely ignoring the decades of emotional abuse, the systematic financial exploitation, and the fact that she had treated me like a disposable servant. She honestly believed she could erase the horrifying reality of her actions by shedding a few fake tears over a cellular connection. We are a family, Emma. Linda continued to sob, her voice cracking dramatically. You cannot do this to us. You cannot let this happen to your own flesh and blood. Terrence just abandoned your sister in a parking lot and drove away. Ashley is completely hysterical, and she has absolutely nowhere to go. We are sitting in a dark, hot house with no electricity and no money. Please, Emma, I am begging you to show some compassion. I know I said some harsh things, but I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to push you to be stronger. I am your mother and I love you. I stared at the phone, feeling absolutely nothing. Her words were a poorly constructed script designed entirely to manipulate my empathy. She was not apologizing for destroying my mental health or stealing my money. She was apologizing because she was hot broke and terrified of the police. Before I could even process her fake maternal affection, I heard a scuffling sound through the speaker. Richard had aggressively grabbed the phone away from his crying wife. Emma, you need to listen to me right now, Richard pleaded. His deep, booming, authoritative voice was reduced to a frantic, wavering whisper. I made a terrible mistake. I admit it. I made a massive error in judgment, but I only did it to protect our family. I was trying to save your sister's anniversary party. I was trying to keep our social standing intact. You know how important our reputation is in this neighborhood. I remained completely silent, letting the recording software capture every single syllable of his desperate confession. You have to call the bank, Emma. Richard begged, his breathing heavy and erratic. You have the power to fix this right now. You are the sole guarantor of Titan Holdings. You just need to call the Federal Banking Commission and the Regional Credit Union. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell the investigators that you verbally authorized me to sign those loan documents on your behalf. Tell them it was just a clerical error and that you fully approve the $60,000 equity line. If you just retract the formal complaint, they will drop the federal fraud investigation. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. My father was actively begging me to commit federal perjury. He wanted me to lie to government banking investigators and permanently ruin my pristine corporate auditing license just to save him from the consequences of his own intentional felony. He genuinely believed that his freedom was inherently more valuable than my entire career and my legal record. Please, Emma. Richard's voice broke into a pathetic, wet sob. I am an old man. I have heart problems and high blood pressure. I cannot survive in a federal prison. The stress alone will literally kill me. We are your family. We gave you life. Are you really going to stand by and send your own father to a federal penitentiary over a simple financial misunderstanding? I looked at the digital recording software on my laptop screen. The audio wavelengths peaked and valleyed, perfectly capturing his entire criminal admission and his blatant attempt to solicit perjury. I had everything I needed. The trap was completely sealed. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool marble island. I positioned my face directly over the microphone of the smartphone. I did not yell. I did not sound angry or bitter. My voice was as calm, smooth, and deeply cold as a frozen lake. "I am not sending you to prison, Richard," I replied with absolute flawless enunciation. "You sent yourself to prison the second you forged my legal signature on a federal banking document. You stole my money. You mocked my existence. You demanded that I leave the house I paid for." "Emma, please," Linda screamed in the background. "We just want peace. We just want our family to be whole again." I smiled a sharp, ruthless smile that they could not see but would definitely feel. I pressed my finger over the red end call button, waiting for the perfect final second. "I am just helping you two have the peace you wanted without me." I pressed the button, terminating the connection instantly. The line went dead. I saved the audio file, locked my laptop, and poured myself another glass of sparkling water. The silence in my penthouse returned absolute and unbroken. I had delivered my final verdict, and there was no appeal. 80 days had passed since I walked out of that toxic suburban house and severed their financial lifeline. Inside those walls, the atmosphere had degraded into a suffocating nightmare of panic and denial. The electricity had been temporarily restored using the initial pathetic loan from Aunt Carol, but the looming threat of the federal banking investigation hung over Richard and Linda like an executioner's blade. Despite the absolute financial ruin surrounding her, Ashley refused to let go of her grand illusion. Terrence had barely spoken to her since the humiliating confrontation at the upscale restaurant. He had packed a large travel bag and was currently staying at a premium downtown hotel while he angrily assessed his legal and marital options. Ashley firmly believed that if she could just execute the spectacular 5-year anniversary gala, she could somehow win him back and repair her shattered image. She convinced herself that Terrence was only angry about the public embarrassment and that a massive, undeniable display of wealth would instantly cure his doubts and bring him home. Ashley aggressively cornered her terrified parents in the kitchen one evening. She screamed that they owed her this spectacular party. She completely blamed them for ruining her marriage by getting caught in their ridiculous financial lies. She demanded that Linda swallow her fragile pride and beg Aunt Carol for another massive high-interest personal loan. This time, it was not for a measly $2,000 to keep the lights on and the refrigerator running. Ashley needed the final $40,000 to pay the elite event coordinators at Prestige Events. Richard sat frozen at the kitchen island, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming fear of his impending federal arrest. Linda, however, could not deny her precious golden child. Driven by a twisted combination of maternal guilt and her own desperate psychotic need to maintain their high society facade, Linda picked up her phone. She pleaded with her sister, crying manufactured tears and offering an outrageous interest rate. She even promised to hand over her vintage designer jewelry collection as hard collateral. Carol, sensing their absolute desperation and enjoying the sudden shift in power, agreed to wire the exorbitant funds. Ashley immediately paid the event planners. The gourmet caterers, the classical string orchestra, and the premium florists were officially booked for the upcoming weekend. They were throwing a lavish, expensive celebration on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. While Ashley was busy finalizing the butter-poached lobster menu for her extravagant illusion, I was sitting in a sleek glass conference room with my corporate attorney, David. We were reviewing the complete financial timeline of Titan Holdings, LLC. The mandatory waiting periods for the initial past due rent notices had officially expired. Richard and Linda had completely ignored the certified legal demands, choosing instead to funnel borrowed money into a fake high society party. David placed a fresh, thick stack of legal documents on the polished mahogany table. It was time to initiate the final aggressive phase of the extraction. I instructed him to file a formal unlawful detainer lawsuit with the county civil court immediately. I was not just filing a standard eviction for basic non-payment of rent. I directed David to include the irrefutable hard evidence of Richard attempting to secure a fraudulent home equity line of credit against my estate. I wanted the court to see exactly what kind of malicious tenants were occupying my corporate asset. In the strict eyes of the law, Richard's forged signature and fake loan application constituted a deliberate, illegal attempt to encumber and permanently damage the property owner. David expedited the formal filing, utilizing his elite connections to push the emergency paperwork directly to the desk of a seasoned, strict county judge. We did not have to wait long for the judicial system to process the absolute mountain of evidence I had meticulously compiled. The judge reviewed the massive unpaid rental balances that had accumulated over the past 80 days. He examined the time-stamped bank logs, the security footage stills, and the forged signature on the regional credit union application. The legal picture painted by my attorney was completely undeniable and heavily documented. The tenants were not just defaulting on their monthly financial obligations due to hardship. They were actively engaging in criminal fraud that directly threatened the financial integrity of the property owner. They were hostile, malicious occupants who posed an immediate danger to the corporate asset. The judge did not hesitate. He did not request a secondary mediation hearing or offer a temporary stay of execution for the struggling family. He picked up his heavy fountain pen and signed the official writ of possession. It was a strict, immediate, and completely ruthless eviction order. The document legally authorized the county sheriff department to arrive at the suburban estate and forcibly remove Richard, Linda, and Ashley from the premises without any further warning. The judge stamped the order, sealing their fate. My parents had just spent $40,000 of Aunt Carol's high-interest money to buy imported white orchids and premium champagne for a party they would never actually get to host. The 90-day countdown was officially over. The brutal reality they had tried so desperately to ignore was finally knocking on their front door, and the armed authorities were already scheduling the physical extraction. Day 90 arrived with clear blue skies and a gentle suburban breeze masking the absolute destruction waiting just out of sight. The sprawling backyard of the estate had been completely transformed into a breathtaking high society paradise. The event planners had utilized every single dollar of Aunt Carol's high-interest loan to construct a flawless illusion of generational wealth. Cascading arrangements of imported white orchids draped elegantly over the tall stone columns of the patio. A 10-piece classical string orchestra played softly from a raised wooden platform, while professional waitstaff in crisp black uniforms circulated with heavy silver trays of vintage champagne and butter-poached lobster appetizers. It was an absolute masterclass in grand financial delusion. Dozens of wealthy guests, including Terrence's affluent parents and extended relatives who had flown in from Chicago, mingled on the manicured lawn. They marveled at the sheer scale of the luxurious celebration, completely unaware that the ground they stood on was legally slipping away. Ashley floated through the crowded garden, wearing a custom-beaded gown that sparkled brilliantly under the afternoon sun. She held a crystal flute, playing the role of the flawless, glowing wife to absolute perfection. She laughed loudly, tossing her perfectly styled hair and greedily accepting the lavish compliments from her wealthy in-laws. She firmly believed that this overwhelming display of purchased luxury would erase the humiliating restaurant disaster and force her husband to return home. She convinced herself that Terrence would see this magnificent party and realize she was a high-value partner worth keeping. When Terrence finally stepped onto the stone patio, Ashley practically threw herself into his arms. She expected a romantic, passionate reunion in front of their captive audience to validate her fragile ego. Terrence did not return her embrace. He stood rigid in his dark, tailored suit, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, hard calculation. He allowed her to hold his arm purely for the benefit of his observing parents, but his dark eyes were completely dead. He had spent the last week residing in a premium downtown hotel, silently securing top-tier divorce attorneys and untangling his own finances from Ashley's toxic web. He only attended this ridiculous expensive gala to save face with his Chicago relatives and to personally witness the final desperate thrashing of his delusional wife. When Ashley leaned in and whispered in her husband's ear about how beautiful their future together would be, Terrence simply stared straight ahead and took a slow mechanical sip of his drink. He did not say a single reassuring word back to her. His silence was a deafening indictment of their entire fake marriage. On the other side of the sparkling swimming pool, Richard and Linda were performing the most exhausting acting routine of their entire lives. Richard wore a light linen summer suit, holding a premium cigar he could not actually afford to light. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy shade of red, and he was sweating profusely despite the mild weather. Every time a guest praised the magnificent house or the extravagant catering, Richard forced a loud, booming laugh that sounded brittle and entirely hollow. He was living in a state of constant paralyzing terror, jumping at every sudden noise, fully expecting federal banking investigators to drag him away in handcuffs for the forged loan application. Linda stood firmly by his side, gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She smiled sweetly at Terrence's mother, exchanging polite country club gossip, while her internal reality was violently collapsing. She adjusted her designer dress, projecting the image of a serene, wealthy matriarch who had everything perfectly under control. They had leveraged their absolute last shred of dignity and drained Carol's bank account to fund this party, relying entirely on the desperate hope that I would simply give up and let them win. They thought my silence over the past 10 days meant I had retreated. They genuinely believed their sheer audacity could overpower the strict letter of the law. The sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawn and reflecting off the crystal glassware. The string orchestra finished a beautiful classical piece, and the lead event coordinator signaled for the formal toasts to begin. Waiters quickly moved through the crowd, ensuring every single guest held a full glass of champagne. Ashley grabbed a wireless microphone and stepped up onto the elevated stone patio stairs, pulling a stiff, unsmiling Terrence up right next to her. She looked out over the sea of wealthy faces, her own parents beaming at her with manufactured pride from the front row. Ashley began a long, highly dramatic speech about the unwavering power of true love and the unbreakable foundation of a supportive, wealthy family. She explicitly thanked Richard and Linda for providing this magnificent estate and for always ensuring their children had the absolute best life had to offer. She stared lovingly at Terrence, praising his non-existent business success and painting a picture of a flawless power couple destined to rule the suburban elite. Terrence's parents nodded approvingly, completely taken in by the expensive charade. The guests raised their crystal glasses high into the air, preparing to cheer for the young couple. Richard puffed his chest out momentarily, forgetting his impending federal fraud charges. Linda smiled victoriously, believing she had successfully outsmarted reality and secured her daughter's wealthy marriage. Then a distinct piercing sound cut sharply through the polite applause. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance. Within seconds, the noise grew exponentially louder, rapidly approaching their exclusive suburban street. The deep, aggressive blare of heavy police sirens shattered the elegant classical music playing in the background. The guests slowly lowered their glasses, turning their heads in deep confusion toward the front of the house. The harsh, brilliant flashes of red and blue emergency lights began bouncing aggressively off the pristine white orchids and illuminating the surrounding neighborhood trees. The absolute ultimate reality check had officially arrived right on schedule. The wail of the sirens grew deafening, tearing violently through the serene atmosphere of the lavish anniversary gala. The 10-piece string orchestra abruptly stopped playing their bows, hovering awkwardly over their cellos and violins. The affluent guests lowered their crystal champagne flutes, murmuring in deep confusion, as the harsh, aggressive flashes of red and blue emergency lights painted the pristine white floral arrangements in alarming neon colors. The heavy iron gates of the suburban estate swung open. Two large, heavily armored county sheriff vehicles aggressively pulled into the expansive circular driveway, their thick tires crunching loudly over the imported gravel. The true spectacle, however, was what followed immediately behind them. Two massive commercial moving trucks bearing the bold, unmistakable logo of a professional property extraction and eviction crew rumbled onto the property. They parked at harsh angles, deliberately blocking the entire exit route and casting massive dark shadows over the manicured front lawn. The sheer size of the moving trucks completely shattered any illusion that this was a simple noise complaint or a friendly neighborhood patrol. This was a highly coordinated tactical removal. Ashley stood frozen on the elevated stone patio stairs, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the wireless microphone. Her glittering, custom-beaded gown suddenly looked entirely ridiculous against the backdrop of flashing police lights. Terrence remained standing right beside her, his face an absolute mask of cold, unfeeling stone. He did not ask what was happening because he already knew. He simply took another slow, calculated sip of his drink, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Four uniformed deputies stepped out of the heavy vehicles, followed by the lead county sheriff. The sheriff was a tall, imposing man with a stern, uncompromising expression. He was not there to negotiate. He carried a thick, heavy clipboard with an official bright red judicial seal pressed against the front page. His heavy black boots echoed loudly against the stone walkway as he bypassed the terrified valet attendants and marched directly toward the backyard patio. He completely ignored the sea of wealthy guests in their designer suits and expensive evening gowns. His eyes were locked dead on the front of the crowd. Richard, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of the situation, desperately tried to intercept the authorities. He puffed out his chest and forced a wide, completely fake smile, attempting to deploy the arrogant country club charm that had always shielded him in the past. He stepped in front of the sheriff, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He loudly declared that there must be a terrible misunderstanding and that this was a highly exclusive private event for influential local families. He aggressively demanded that the officers lower their lights and step inside his home office to resolve the clerical error like gentlemen. The sheriff did not even break his stride. He stepped right past Richard, forcing the older man to stumble backward into a tray of appetizers. The sheriff walked directly to the center of the patio and raised his voice easily, projecting over the panicked whispers of the crowd. He loudly and clearly demanded to identify Richard, Linda, and Ashley by their full legal names. The absolute authority in his tone caused the entire garden to fall into a dead, suffocating silence. Linda let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. She shrank behind a tall floral arrangement, desperately trying to hide her face from Terrence's wealthy Chicago relatives. Terrence's mother brought a trembling hand to her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock and growing disgust. The sheriff unclipped the thick stack of legal documents from his board. He did not lower his voice. He had absolutely zero interest in protecting their fragile social standing. He announced to the entire silent crowd that the extended legal grace period had officially expired. He stated clearly that a county judge had granted an immediate physical eviction order on behalf of the strict legal property owner, Titan Holdings LLC. He looked directly at Richard and Linda, declaring that they had unlawfully detained the property while accumulating massive unpaid financial obligations. Richard opened his mouth to protest, to scream that he was the owner of the estate, but the sheriff swiftly cut him off. The officer explicitly stated that the eviction was expedited due to severe malicious activity, including a highly active federal investigation into a fraudulent banking application filed against the property. The mention of federal fraud hung in the air like a dropped bomb. Terrence's father, who had built his legitimate business on strict integrity, took a massive step backward, physically distancing himself from Richard, as if the man were carrying a highly contagious disease. The sheriff delivered the final devastating blow. He announced that Richard, Linda, and Ashley had exactly 15 minutes to gather their essential personal belongings such as medications and basic identification. After that strict time frame, the commercial moving crew would begin seizing, packing, and physically removing all unauthorized property from the premises. He ordered them to vacate the estate immediately or face physical arrest for criminal trespassing. The flawless illusion of the wealthy, powerful family shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the grass. The guests who had just been raising their glasses in a toast were now staring at their hosts with sheer horror and profound judgment. The whispers started instantly spreading through the crowd like a vicious wildfire. They were not wealthy elites. They were broke, desperate criminals being thrown out onto the street in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. Ashley completely snapped. The terrifying reality of her absolute poverty and public humiliation finally broke her fragile mind. She dropped the microphone, and it hit the stone steps with a loud, piercing screech. She began to scream a raw, guttural sound of pure, unhinged fury. She shrieked that this was an illegal setup, that her sister was a jealous monster trying to ruin her perfect life. Her face contorted into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. A waiter carrying a silver tray of fresh champagne flutes tried to quickly scurry out of her way. Ashley turned and aggressively slapped her hand against the tray. The crystal glasses flew through the air and shattered violently against the patio stones, sending expensive champagne and sharp glass flying in every direction. She stomped her designer heels into the broken crystals, screaming at the police officers to get off her land. Terrence did not try to calm her down. He did not reach out to protect his wife. He simply stood there watching her humiliate herself beyond any point of return. The wealthy guests recovering from their initial shock did not look away out of respect. Instead, the absolute undeniable spectacle of the moment took over. Hands reached into expensive purses and tailored suit pockets. Across the manicured lawn, dozens of high-definition smartphone screens lit up. The guests pressed record, capturing every single second of Ashley's violent screaming tantrum and Richard's pathetic sobbing collapse. They were documenting the spectacular, fiery destruction of the fake empire for the entire world to see. The chaotic symphony of shattering glass and Ashley screaming at the county deputies was suddenly interrupted by the low, powerful hum of a massive engine. The heavy iron gates, which had been left wide open by the police cruisers, now welcomed a brand new arrival. A sleek, flawless black luxury SUV glided onto the imported gravel driveway. It moved with a slow, deliberate, predatory grace that instantly commanded the attention of every single person on the sprawling lawn. The wealthy guests who had been busy recording Ashley's epic meltdown slowly lowered their smartphones. They turned their heads toward the imposing vehicle, completely captivated by the sheer aura of wealth and authority it projected. The vehicle parked perfectly parallel to the sheriff's cruiser. The heavy tinted rear door swung open, and a thick, heavy silence fell over the chaotic garden. I stepped out of the back seat, and my designer heels made a sharp, crisp sound against the pavement. I was not wearing a glittering party dress or pretending to be a high society socialite. I wore an immaculate tailored midnight blue power suit that screamed absolute corporate dominance. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was an impenetrable mask of cold, calculated calm. I walked past the massive moving trucks and the flashing police lights, moving with the effortless confidence of a woman who completely owned the very ground she was stepping on. The whispering among the wealthy Chicago relatives and the local suburban elites intensified. They had no idea who I was, but they could instantly tell that I was the one pulling the strings. Terrence stood on the elevated stone patio watching my approach. He recognized the ruthless efficiency in my stride. He simply crossed his arms and watched the final act of this magnificent play unfold, completely stepping aside to let me deliver the fatal blow. Richard spotted me from across the lawn. The sight of me looking so wealthy and entirely in control completely shattered whatever tiny fraction of sanity he had left. He broke away from the sheriff and sprinted across the grass toward me. His light linen summer suit was stained with sweat and spilled champagne. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror and desperate, pathetic panic. He practically threw himself in front of me, waving his hands wildly in the air. "Emma, you have to stop them," he begged, his booming voice reduced to a frantic, squeaky whine. "You have to tell the sheriff this is a massive mistake. You are humiliating us in front of everyone. You are destroying our reputation. Please, Emma. We are your parents. You cannot throw us out on the street like garbage in front of the whole neighborhood. Linda was standing a few feet away, clutching her chest and weeping loudly, trying to generate sympathy from the staring crowd. Ashley had completely frozen, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief as she realized the older sister she had relentlessly mocked was the architect of her absolute destruction. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked at the pathetic, trembling man standing in front of me, and I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, ruthless grin of a financial auditor who had just balanced the books perfectly. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I did not say a single word to Richard. Instead, I walked directly past him and headed straight toward the massive professional audio equipment the event planners had set up for the string orchestra and the anniversary toasts. The sound technician had abandoned his post when the police arrived, leaving the main mixing console completely unattended. I stepped onto the elevated wooden platform and tapped the screen of my phone. I activated the Bluetooth connection. The system chimed loudly, signaling a successful pairing with the towering concert-grade speakers surrounding the patio. I opened the secure cloud folder labeled Legal Evidence and selected the very first audio file I had saved 90 days ago. The entire garden was dead silent, holding its collective breath. Everyone from the county deputies to the catering staff watched me with rapt attention. I pressed play. The sound of my mother's voice blasted through the massive speakers, echoing off the stone columns and ringing clearly across the manicured lawn for every single wealthy guest to hear. Emma is always causing drama. My mother's recorded voice sneered, dripping with absolute disdain. If she moved out, we could finally have some peace. Then my father's recorded voice boomed through the speakers, confirming her vicious sentiment. She is too attached to us. She will never leave. The recording ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The wealthy guests stared at Richard and Linda with profound, utter disgust. Terrence's mother literally turned her back on Linda, refusing to even look at her. The grand illusion was entirely dead. The recorded proof of their breathtaking hypocrisy and arrogance hung heavily in the evening air, completely destroying any remaining shred of their fake high society dignity. Richard fell to his knees on the grass, completely broken by the inescapable reality of his own recorded words. Ashley covered her face with her hands, unable to handle the intense public humiliation. I looked down at my father and casually slipped my smartphone back into my tailored suit pocket. I made sure my voice carried clearly over the quiet evening breeze, perfectly audible to the sheriff, the moving crew, and the horrified guests. I moved out. I stated my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any mercy. And now it is your turn. Parasite time is over. The sheriff gave a sharp, definitive nod to the foreman of the commercial moving crew. That single silent gesture unleashed absolute chaos upon the pristine suburban estate. The heavy metal doors of the massive moving truck swung open, and a dozen workers in thick industrial boots marched aggressively onto the property. They did not care about the imported white orchids cascading from the stone columns. They did not care about the butter-poached lobster appetizers sitting on silver platters. They treated the luxurious mansion exactly like a hostile corporate asset that needed to be liquidated immediately. The workers stormed through the heavy oak front doors and began dismantling the fake empire piece by piece. Out came the expensive velvet sofa where Terrence used to sit and pretend to be a successful real estate mogul. Out came the heavy mahogany desk where Richard had foolishly forged his life away on a federal banking document. Out came the custom silk drapes, the flat-screen televisions, and Ashley's massive wardrobe of designer dresses. The pristine, manicured lawn, previously the stage for a high-society anniversary gala, instantly transformed into a humiliating, chaotic dumping ground. The wealthy guests from Chicago stood in absolute stunned silence, watching the physical destruction of the family they thought they knew. The members of the classical string orchestra quietly packed up their cellos and violins, fleeing the property to avoid the escalating legal disaster. Linda tried to physically block a burly mover who was carrying her expensive vanity mirror out the front door. She grabbed the frame and screamed that it was a priceless antique. A county deputy firmly stepped between them. He grabbed Linda by the arm and pulled her aside, warning her in a loud, authoritative voice that she would be placed under immediate physical arrest for obstructing a strict judicial court order. Linda shrank back, her face pale and covered in streaked makeup, completely powerless against the heavy hand of the law. Ashley was completely hysterical. She ran frantically around the grass in her custom-beaded gown, trying to catch her expensive shoes and silk blouses as the movers carelessly tossed them into disorganized cardboard boxes right next to the remaining party guests. The crystal champagne flutes lay shattered on the patio stones, mixing with the dirt and the crushing reality of their absolute bankruptcy. The lavish anniversary party was completely dead. In its place was a spectacular yard sale of broken pride and exposed lies. Terence watched the entire pathetic spectacle with a cold, calculated detachment. He stood near the edge of the stone patio, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his dark, tailored suit. He did not offer a single ounce of help to the frantic, crying women. He stepped carefully over a pile of Linda's thrown designer bags and walked directly toward Ashley. She looked up at him, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks, making her look entirely ridiculous. She reached out her manicured hands, begging him to help her salvage her belongings and her dignity. She cried out that they could start over, that his wealthy parents could help them secure a new, beautiful house in a different, upscale neighborhood. Terence looked at her with a level of disgust so profound it made the surrounding air feel freezing cold. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice or cause an unnecessary scene. He simply reached down to his left hand. He slid the heavy gold wedding band off his finger. He held the expensive piece of jewelry in the air for a fraction of a second, forcing Ashley to watch as he completely severed their connection. He dropped the ring directly onto the dirt right next to her ruined designer heels. He looked at his sobbing wife and spoke with absolute flawless finality. "The divorce papers will be sent to you tomorrow morning if you even have an address to receive them." Terence turned his back on her and walked straight toward the driveway. He marched to his leased luxury sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and drove off the property without looking in the rearview mirror for a single second. His wealthy parents immediately followed his lead. They marched silently past Richard and Linda, getting into their black town car and speeding away from the humiliating disaster, taking their money and their social status back to Chicago forever. Ashley let out a guttural, agonizing scream, falling to her knees in the dirt and clutching her ruined dress. The sheriff suddenly received a sharp electronic alert on his shoulder radio. He listened closely to the dispatch operator, his stern expression hardening even further. He unclipped his radio and confirmed the transmission. He turned around and walked directly toward Richard. My father was sitting on a thrown velvet cushion on the grass, clutching his chest in absolute panic and watching his life completely evaporate. The sheriff announced in a booming voice that he had just received direct confirmation from the Federal Banking Commission. The formal arrest warrant for felony wire fraud and identity theft had been officially approved and signed by a federal judge. The time for serving civil eviction papers was over. This was now a highly active criminal crime scene. 2 heavily armed county deputies flanked Richard instantly. They grabbed his arms and forcefully twisted them behind his back. The sharp, terrifying click of solid metal handcuffs echoed clearly across the ruined garden, cutting through Ashley's loud sobbing. Richard began to cry uncontrollably. The arrogant man who had spent his entire life belittling my career and demanding respect was now weeping like a terrified child. He begged the deputies for mercy, claiming he had a severe medical condition and that his heart could not handle the stress. The deputies completely ignored his pathetic whining. They read him his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, marching him across the imported gravel driveway. They pushed his head down and aggressively shoved him into the back of the armored police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut. Linda watched her husband being locked inside the police vehicle like a common criminal. The flashing red and blue emergency lights reflected brightly off her terrified, tear-stained face. She turned around slowly to look at the massive pile of furniture clothes and broken crystals scattered across the lawn. Her entire life, her elite social standing, her arrogant pride, and her fake generational wealth had been completely eradicated in exactly 90 days. She let out a raw, agonizing scream that ripped through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Her knees buckled violently underneath her, and she collapsed face first onto a pile of cheap cardboard boxes and discarded clothes. I stood perfectly still by my sleek black SUV, watching her hit the absolute rock bottom she dug for herself. 90 days had passed since the flashing red and blue police lights faded into the warm suburban night. The spectacular collapse of my biological family was now a permanent, irreversible reality. The legal and financial consequences of their breathtaking arrogance had crashed down upon them with the absolute force of a wrecking ball. The justice system, operating with cold mechanical efficiency, completely dismantled the fake empire they had spent decades trying to protect. Richard managed to avoid a federal prison cell, but his punishment was arguably a fate far worse for a man so entirely obsessed with his public image. His expensive defense attorney negotiated a plea deal that resulted in 5 years of strict federal probation. He was confined to the state, forced to wear a bulky electronic ankle monitor, and required to report weekly to a highly unsympathetic probation officer. But the true devastating blow was the total annihilation of his financial identity. The federal fraud conviction permanently and completely destroyed his credit score. He was legally flagged by every major banking institution in the country. Richard could never again apply for a mortgage, sign a commercial lease, or even secure a basic low-limit credit card. He was officially a financial ghost, completely stripped of the artificial purchasing power that had defined his entire pathetic existence. Without Richard's ability to borrow money, Linda and Ashley were thrown violently into a harsh, unfamiliar world. Their new residence was not a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and imported white orchids. They were forced to move into a cheap, run-down extended-stay motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. The cramped rooms smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach, a stark, horrifying contrast to the luxury they once demanded. Ashley's spectacular downfall was absolute. Terrence made good on his parking lot promise. His ruthless legal team expedited a brutal divorce settlement that left her with absolutely zero spousal support. He successfully argued that she had lured him into a fraudulent marriage under completely false financial pretenses. Ashley lost her husband, her fake wealthy status, and her entire social media following. The golden child was entirely stripped of her gold. To survive and to pay back the massive high-interest $40,000 loan they foolishly begged from Aunt Carol, Linda, and Ashley were forced into the exact type of labor they had spent their entire lives mocking. Aunt Carol showed absolutely zero familial mercy. She demanded her money back with aggressive weekly installments, threatening to sue them in civil court if they defaulted. To meet her ruthless demands, Linda and Ashley secured jobs as waitresses at a greasy local diner located just off the interstate highway. The two women who previously spent their afternoons sipping vintage champagne and criticizing the working class were now forced to wear cheap, stiff polyester uniforms. They spent their days wiping down sticky tables, carrying heavy trays of fried food, and enduring the loud demands of impatient truck drivers. Their soft, manicured hands were now permanently calloused and burned from hot industrial dishwater. The karmic retribution was flawless and completely inescapable. While they were busy scrubbing diner tables, I was busy closing the most satisfying financial transaction of my entire career. Once the suburban estate was completely emptied of their toxic presence, I immediately listed the property on the competitive real estate market. Without the parasitic drain of their constant utility usage and reckless behavior, the pristine house attracted multiple aggressive buyers. Within 3 weeks, Titan Holdings LLC accepted a massive all-cash offer from a legitimate, wealthy tech executive. The property closed seamlessly through escrow, yielding a spectacular net profit that far exceeded my initial rescue investment from 4 years ago. I had effectively monetized my own traumatic past, turning their eviction into a massive corporate victory. I did not simply hoard the massive profit in a silent offshore account. I took a significant portion of the real estate windfall and transferred it directly into a newly established philanthropic endowment. I created a robust academic and professional scholarship fund specifically designed for young, driven women attempting to escape toxic, manipulative family environments. The grant provided full university tuition and aggressive financial literacy training, ensuring that these young women would never have to rely on abusive relatives or arrogant men for their basic survival. I used the money generated from my family's absolute financial failure to purchase total absolute freedom for women who actually deserved it. I was breaking the vicious cycle of dependency and using my professional skills to construct impenetrable safety nets for the next generation. The sun was slowly setting over the sprawling downtown skyline, casting a brilliant array of orange and purple light against the towering glass skyscrapers. I stood alone on the expansive private balcony of my luxury penthouse. The evening air was crisp and refreshing, carrying the vibrant, energetic hum of the city far below. I wore a tailored silk robe, feeling the soft, expensive fabric against my skin. I held a delicate crystal glass filled with a rare, expensive vintage red wine. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue. I looked out over the glittering horizon, feeling a profound, absolute sense of weightlessness. There were no more incoming frantic phone calls demanding utility payments. There were no more fake high society dinners where I had to sit in silence and swallow their cruel, calculated insults. There were no more manipulative guilt trips designed to drain my bank accounts and feed their endless, ravenous egos. My mother had stood in my living room exactly 90 days ago, loudly complaining that I caused too much drama. She had explicitly stated that if I just moved out, they could finally have some peace. I smiled, taking another slow, satisfying sip of my wine. I had given them exactly what they asked for. I had removed my financial protection, my patience, and my presence from their lives forever. The profound, overwhelming silence in my beautiful penthouse was the greatest reward I could have ever imagined. I had completely severed the rotting branches of my family tree, and the roots I planted for myself were entirely unbreakable. I took a deep, cleansing breath and looked up at the darkening sky. I had finally found my peace, and it was absolutely magnificent. The harrowing journey of escaping a toxic family dynamic teaches us a profound and necessary lesson. Shared DNA does not automatically entitle anyone to your peace, your resources, or your sanity. For too long, society has pushed the narrative that we must endure emotional and financial abuse simply because it comes from blood relatives. However, this story completely shatters that dangerous illusion. It demonstrates that true family is built on a strict foundation of mutual respect, unconditional support, and genuine care rather than exploitation and narcissistic entitlement. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the absolute necessity of financial independence. Wealth and financial literacy are not just tools for acquiring luxury, they are the ultimate shields against manipulation. By quietly building her own corporate success and maintaining strict control over her assets, the protagonist was able to walk away from decades of gaslighting. She did not need to scream, negotiate, or beg for basic human decency. Her financial independence gave her the power to enforce her boundaries with ruthless mathematical precision. It allowed her to pull the safety net that her abusers had taken for granted and watch them face the natural, devastating consequences of their own arrogance and financial illiteracy. Ultimately, the most beautiful takeaway is about redefining and reclaiming your self-worth. You cannot heal in the same toxic environment that broke you, and walking away from manipulative people is never an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. When you stop pouring your energy into a bottomless pit of ungrateful expectations, you finally have the space and strength to build a magnificent life of your own. Take control of your own narrative today and never apologize for cutting toxic ties to protect your peace and your future.